Welcome everyone to this session of Real HE, and I'm really delighted to be able to invite Dr. Ashley Robertson, who's going to talk to us about her evaluation and research of designing group work agreements. I'll be chairing the session. My name's Louise Taylor. I'm a Professor of Education and Student Experience at Oxford Brookes University, and I'm the director of this network. So Ashley is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Glasgow. She's programme lead for the MSc in Psychological Studies. She also leads the Pedagogy and Education Research Unit, which is the group for the Psychology Schools Learning and Teaching Scholarship Network. So without further ado, I think I'll hand over to Ashley to talk to us about designing group work agreements. And this is certainly a topic close to my heart for one of my modules. So I'm hoping I can get some great tips from you about how to do this. Thank you, Ashley.
Well, thank you. As Louise says, my name is Ashley Robertson, and I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my colleagues Maxine Swingler and Wilhelmina Toivo. So all of us are based in the School of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Glasgow. So today I'm going to be talking about group work, and specifically how we've tried to make it a better experience for students by developing a group agreement activity where students establish their own expectations and ways of working. So I'll be sharing both the thinking behind the resource and some early findings from our evaluation of it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences as well as any questions as well. So to set the scene a little bit, why does group work matter? And why did we feel the need to do something about it? So group work is increasingly recognised as an important graduate attribute, and working effectively in teams is an essential skill across many different professional contexts. It's also a really valuable form of authentic assessment. So research by Forsell and colleagues suggests that it helps to develop employability skills, which is something that's really important. But the evidence also tells us that students and staff also find assessed group work really challenging, and for quite different reasons. From the student side, research shows that students can find assessed group work unfair, they can feel anxious about it, and they're often worried about unequal contributions from group members. And these are very understandable, I think, and something that many of us will have come across. From the staff side, while group work can reduce marking workload, that benefit can then quickly be negated when groups run into problems and need staff intervention. Peer assessment, which is where students assess each other's contributions to the group, which then often influences each other's final grade, can then introduce its own issues around fairness and can inadvertently disadvantage certain groups of students. So, for example, those that are neurodivergent. So there's a clear gap between what group work can offer and what students and staff actually experience. And that gap is really what motivated us to try to do the work that we've done and that I'm going to talk about today. So I wanted to kind of start things off by giving a bit of context about where this work came from. So the group agreement activity was originally developed for Research Methods 2, which is a core course on our MSc conversion programmes here at Glasgow. So we have two of these that are delivered on campus, Psychological Science and Psychological Studies. It's a relatively large course. We have around 100 students and it runs over 10 weeks with weekly lab sessions. We also use the resource on our online distance learning version of the course and on other programmes within the school, so we're able to see how it works across different teaching contexts. So one thing worth noting is that this particular cohort is really diverse. So we have a large international student group, and students come from very varied academic backgrounds. So some will have a scientific background from their previous degree, so those are the psychological science students, and others will have studied humanities or social sciences, and those are more the psychological studies students. And the diversity is one of the things that makes our course so rich. So yeah, the diversity is one of the things that makes our course so rich, but it also then means that students come into group work with quite different expectations and ways of working, which was essentially one of the motivations for us in developing the resource. The group work component itself is a qualitative project. So students start off by designing a research question for their study. They work together to submit a group research proposal, and that's worth 30% of their final grade. Then they design and run a focus group together. And at this point, the group element of it ends. Students then analyse the data individually that they gathered in groups, and they submit an individual report that's worth 50%. So it's that component, the group proposal, where everyone receives the same grades, that's really been at the root of many of the challenges that we've been seeing. So when students feel that their own grades then depend on others, or quite heavily on others, it can create tensions within the group. So we can see that on the next slide. So what were we seeing in practice? So we had a huge variety of experiences across the cohort. So some groups worked really fantastically well together, but others ran into real difficulties. And the difficulties tended to fall into a few different patterns. So the most common issues were around unequal contributions. Some students felt that they were doing more than their fair share, and other students weren't contributing as much. We also saw mismatched expectations within groups. So that might have been around how much effort to put in, or different expectations in terms of what was appropriate, in terms of the amount of communication, or even things like what grade they were aiming for. So some were aiming for a pass and others wanted a high A. And we also saw that students were often reluctant to raise issues with staff. So sometimes because they didn't want to tell on their classmates, sometimes because of cultural differences in terms of seeing staff as people who impart or pass on knowledge rather than as sources of support, and sometimes simply because they just didn't know how to approach us. So to give you some scale of the problem, in one particularly difficult year, almost half of our groups reported issues. So it was 48.7%. We also had multiple groups breaking apart in the weeks just before the submission, which was really stressful for everybody who was involved, both students and staff. And that was the kind of motivation for us to do the work that we've done. So we previously used a peer rating system to try to address some of the issues where students rated each other's contributions as part of the assessment. And to be fair, it did sometimes work quite well in terms of reducing social loafing, where one or two students post along on the efforts of others, but it did also create its own problems. So students would sometimes use the ratings to punish people they didn't get on with at a personal level, rather than reflecting genuinely on the contributions. So then as staff, we found ourselves in a really difficult situation where we were trying to disentangle after we'd kind of heard about the issues of whether someone genuinely wasn't contributing or whether they were actually just had rubbed someone up the wrong way in their group. So we made 4 key changes. So we introduced a group agreement with a task allocation template. We moved to a model of proactive staff support, and we've removed the peer rating system. And I'll walk you through these in a bit more detail in a moment. And I'm kind of pleased to say that in recent years, both the severity and the frequency of the issues has dropped considerably. So we're now closer to about 5% of groups reporting problems. And the problems that are flagged tend to be more easily resolved. We are cautious about over-interpreting that, given that other factors might be at play. So part of it might have been that they were coming out after COVID, and we had a larger cohort then, so it might be those things as well. But regardless of the reasons underlying it, it's also really good to see that there's been an improvement. So before I get into detail of the resource itself, I wanted to kind of take a step back and think about what we actually mean by group work skills, because this is really important in terms of influencing how we design the activity. So Reeb and colleagues argue that supporting students in collaborative working is something that's really important. It's not that we should just assume that students know how to work together in a group. And when we look at the research more closely, we can see that group work skills can broadly be split into two categories. So on the one hand, there are interpersonal skills. So that's the kind of relational human side of working together in a group. So things like offering support to others, communicating openly, being sensitive to how your group members are feeling. On the other hand, there are task skills. So that's the kind of more practical organizational side. So things like setting clear goals, defining roles, and then monitoring how the group is progressing. And the thing is that both of these matter. It's not just enough to be good at the task side if the group dynamic isn't working, and kind of vice versa. So when we designed our group agreement activity, we deliberately set out to try to support both of those skill sets. And you'll see that in the way that it's structured. And I'll come back to this distinction later in terms of how we evaluated the activity. So what did we actually do? So the activity is one thing, but there are other components that go alongside it. So there's the group agreement and task allocation itself. There's a staff support element and what we call the Celebrate Collaboration prize. So starting with the group agreement, students are asked to establish shared expectations around things like communication and behaviour. They're asked to allocate tasks amongst themselves, and then they're asked to submit the agreement and the task allocation to the VLE, and they're asked to do that individually. So the individual submission part is quite important because it means that each student has then essentially indicating that they have personally committed to the agreement, which then helps develop a sense of accountability within the group. And it then becomes something tangible that the group can then refer back to if things aren't going as planned or if things need to change. The second component is the staff support element, and this is where we made a deliberate shift from a reactive to more of a proactive approach. So rather than waiting for groups to come to us with problems, we then monitored submissions, these individual submissions, and we reach out directly to any students or groups who haven't had everyone submit within the group. So as well as finding out maybe if someone isn't engaging with the group, we also found that this kind of signals to students that we're paying attention and that we want to support them. And we don't have any data on it, but anecdotally, it seems to lower the threshold in terms of students then asking for help when something goes wrong. And I also want to mention here that this shift to proactive support was part of the broader changes that we made. So including the decision to remove the peer rating system entirely. So we felt that the group agreement combined with the proactive approach was a better way within the particular approach that we had to address contribution issues without the fairness problems that the peer rating had introduced. And then the third component is the Celebrate Collaboration prize. So this is where we as staff nominate the groups that we've observed working particularly well together. And crucially, this is completely independently of grades. So it's about recognising effort and process, not just output, and then reframing what success in group work actually looks like. So each lab tutor nominates a group, and then a shortlist is developed, and then the shortlisted groups are all told that they were nominated, and then the winner is announced. And that might be in a social event or it might be during the final lecture. So this year, the winning group was one that had a member with a broken ankle who was unable to attend the class, and they'd worked really well together to make sure that the group member stayed included in the project, even getting them to join staff office hours through one of the group's laptops so that they were all attending together. So what does the group agreement actually look like in practice? So I'll kind of walk you through some of the items that students are working with. So the agreement is structured in two parts, which you can see in the slide. So on the left, we have what's called the standing items. So these are the non-negotiable commitments that all students agree to, regardless of which group they're in. So they cover things that like treating group members with dignity and respect, abiding by university policies around conduct and dignity at work, communicating openly and raising any issues with course leads early on, and also contributing fairly by completing tasks by agreed deadlines. And the purpose of having those standing items in is to provide a baseline, essentially some sort of shared foundation that every group should start from. And on the right, we have student chosen items, and this is where the kind of element of ownership comes in. So groups discuss these items together and they choose the ones that they feel are most relevant to them. And they can adapt these ones, or they can also choose to add their own as well. So they cover things like agreeing a shared timeline, respecting different ways of working, embracing diversity within the group. So that might be cultural differences, neurodiversity, different work-life commitments, and then also playing to individual strengths when dividing up the tasks. And we dedicate time in class for students to discuss and agree these items. And it gets students kind of talking about their expectations and ways of working right at the start, before any tensions have had a chance to develop. So alongside the group agreement, students also complete a task allocation exercise, and this is the part that students consistently tell us that they find the most useful. And the idea is essentially quite straightforward. Rather than leaving it up to groups to figure out who does what, we provide a pre-prepared list of roles and tasks as a starting point for them. And on the slide, you can see some examples of the kinds of roles and tasks we include. So those are kind of broadly grouped into prep work, lead writing, editing and reviewing, and admin. So lead writing for this particular assignment involves, well, actually, sorry, I'll start with prep work. So prep work covers things like finalising and submitting the group agreement, because they do that before they start, and then identifying and reading studies related to the group's topic. Editing and reviewing would be about pulling the group proposal together into something that is cohesive, or checking that the text citations and the reference lists match. Lead writing would be summarising the background literature and discussing the justification and methodology for the study. And the admin is more the kind of practical side of things, so setting up shared communication channels and keeping track of meeting minutes and to-do lists. And we did this because we thought that having the roles then laid out in advance means that everyone in the group then knows what they're responsible for from the very beginning. And it gives groups a concrete starting point for the discussions as well. So rather than facing a blank page where they have to come up with all the tasks, if we provide a bit of a start for them, and obviously they can adapt that if it doesn't work for them or they need additional tasks. So having described the resource, I'm going to turn now to what we've been doing to evaluate it, because we want to understand whether it's actually making a difference for students. So we've collected data from undergraduate and postgraduate taught students, both first year and third year undergraduates, and the postgraduate taught students are the ones on our MSc programmes. So what we've done is we've measured their group work skills before and after the group work component of their course. We're taking a mixed methods approach, combining quantitative and qualitative data. So on the quantitative side, we've used the Group Work Skills Questionnaire, which was developed by Cumming and colleagues or published by Cumming and colleagues in 2015. And this is a validated 10-item measure where students rate themselves on statements that begin, when working in groups, I tend to. And it captures both of the skill dimensions that I mentioned earlier, so interpersonal and task skills. So there's an example of the interpersonal one is I tend to be sensitive to the feelings of other people, whereas a task one would be I tend to clearly define roles of each team member. On the qualitative side, we are collecting open text responses, asking students about their experiences of group work generally, their experiences of using the group work agreement specifically, and also their suggestions for how we might develop it in the future. So what are we finding? So I want to be upfront that these are preliminary findings. We now have 51 participants, but we need a bit more according to our power analysis. So we can't say anything overly conclusive at this point. But saying that, looking at the data that we have so far, the density plots on the left-hand side show the distribution of scores on both the interpersonal and task subscales at time 1 and time 2, so before and after the group work component. And the table on the right's got the means and standard deviations. So we can see here that there's a different pattern across the two subscales. So for the interpersonal skills, students were already scoring quite highly at baseline, so kind of around the 4 out of 5 mark, and that score remained similar after the group work, so there wasn't any real change on that. However, for the task skills, we can see that the task skills start off a bit lower, but then they seem to improve. So going from around about 3.6 to just below 3.9 at time 2. So as I said, we can't say anything definitive at this point, but the indication would be that if there is a difference, there wouldn't be any difference to interpersonal skills, but there might be to the task skills. And this pattern maybe makes sense given the types of skills, things like defining roles and monitoring progress might be newer territory for many of the students. But we'll see what patterns we observe once we collect a bit more data. So alongside the quantitative data, we've also asked students to share their experiences of using the group agreement in their own words. Similarly, because we haven't collected all the data yet, we still need to properly analyse it. So what I've got here are just some illustrative examples. But I wanted to share 3 quotes with you that captures what students valued about it. So the first quote under role clarity captures something that we heard quite a lot, that having the roles defined in writing was something that was useful. The student here says that defining roles before the group work meant everybody knew what their responsibilities were. So essentially writing down what it was that everyone had to do made the responsibilities real and shared. The second quote under shared responsibility picks up on something slightly different. This one, it was more the reassurance of knowing that someone was specifically taking on that responsibility and that meant that the work would get done. So even if roles overlapped in practice, knowing that there was this sense of ownership meant that things were less likely to fall through the cracks. And the third quote under accountability is quite interesting because the student describes the group agreement as something that's almost like reliable or comforting, so something tangible that they could point to and say, this is your section, you agreed to work on this. They also specifically caveat their comment with, if I was working with strangers, so it might be that the group agreement or the agreeing terms part of it was less useful to them because they were working with people that they already knew. And it might be something that's more useful if they were working with people that they didn't know. So moving on to the broader qualitative findings, and again, as I said, data's still being collected, so they're preliminary patterns. But in terms of what students described, a few things stand out. So the task allocation part was consistently seen as more helpful than the agreeing terms themselves. So the practical side felt more immediately useful than agreeing those shared norms. As I said, as I mentioned in the previous slide, some of the students in our sample, but not all of them, had an element of choice in who they worked with, which then might have had an impact on the interpersonal side. So if you already know and trust your group members, then agreeing those shared norms, or even also the task allocation, they might not feel as necessary. Another thing that came up was that groups didn't always stick rigidly to their initial task allocation, which I think is something that we would all see or quite often see when we work in groups. And while students found the pre-prepared task lists helpful, as a starting point, they wanted additional guidance around things like how many people were needed for each role or how long tasks might take. And it was also clear that adding their own item didn't always feel like it was expected, with some groups then avoiding this part. and just sticking only to the mandatory items, whereas other groups took it really seriously and added and discussed them all and added in their own ones. So in terms of suggestions, the main observations were around 3 different areas. So firstly, making the addition of their own items standard rather than optional. So students suggested that that would be a good thing to do because they thought it was valuable, but it wasn't always clear that this was something that we wanted them to do. Secondly, they thought that setting some minimum expectations around things like communication frequency would be useful. So giving groups a clearer baseline to work from. Do we expect them to meet outside of class once or twice a week? Should they make sure that they check Teams for updates from the rest of the group at least once a day? Things like that. And third, they wanted additional scaffolding around the role allocation. And the reason that they suggested that was that it then allows them to divide the work more realistically, but also more fairly. So it's kind of these suggestions will then, we haven't updated it yet because we need to finish data collection, but once we do another version of the resource, these suggestions will then feed directly into how we develop it in the future. So where are we headed from here? So in terms of our ongoing research questions, the one that we're most actively pursuing at the moment is a comparison between groups who have done group work, and one group used the group agreement and the other group didn't use the group agreement. So we have a small selection of data from first year undergraduates that will allow us to look at this more directly, although we need to gather more. And this is really important because it then gets at a fundamental question. Is it the group agreement itself that's making a difference, or is it simply the experience of doing group work that then develops these skills over time? And then disentangling and better understanding those two things is something that we're really keen to do. Looking further ahead, there are 3 directions that we'd really like to take this work in the long term. So we're really interested in understanding staff experience. Group work can be demanding to support, and we want to know more about the impact on staff, maybe particularly in terms of the confidence of how to deal with issues as they arise. So what is it that would help staff to support students to complete group work successfully? We're also keen to explore how transferable the resource is beyond our own context. Does it work in other disciplines with different types of group work tasks? As I mentioned earlier on in the talk, our approach isn't just about the resource, but it's also about being proactive and also about celebrating success. So we don't know how much of it is down to that as well. We know from other programmes that others only use the resource and don't do these other elements in the same way. And we also want to think more carefully about diverse student needs, thinking specifically, well, for example, about neurodiversity and international students and whether the resource could be better tailored to support those groups. So in terms of next steps, we're continuing data collection, adapting the resource based on the student feedback I've shared today, as well as our own reflections. So the resource is already freely available on Open Science Framework. So if anybody's interested in trying it out or adapting it for your own context, then you're very welcome to do so, and we're very happy to, have a chat about it if that would be helpful. So I've just got the references here, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. So that kind of brings me to the end. So this has been a project that we've developed and trying to address a very real issue that we were experiencing in our teaching, and we're interested to see where it goes. So both in terms of the research and developing the resource. And I'm very happy to take any questions or thoughts.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ashley. And I'm so glad you, at the end, just put the link to the all your resources, because I was thinking all along, where can we access these? How can we use them? How can we share them? So that's fantastic. You've already done it.